This last year with COVID infections and fatalities and job losses and kids struggling through school and poverty rising, it's raised an age-old question just a little bit more often than normal, at least in conversations that I get to have. And that question is one that you've probably asked before, which is this: why do bad things happen to good people? Now, I'm a pastor, and I've wrestled with this question. One of the oldest documents on earth is this Hebrew book called Job, and you might have heard of it before. And this is actually the central question that this ancient document explores. So I don't really think, I'm not optimistic that I'm going to solve it in the next 20 minutes. But we ask, God, how could you be okay with this all the time? It's natural for us to be compelled to ask, like, what does it say about you, God? Or what does it say about karma or the universe or whatever's out there? Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a best-selling book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And in that book, he said, we could bear nearly any pain or disappointment if we thought that there was a reason behind it, a purpose to it. Answer of the question, why? Pretty insightful book, actually. But a lot of people who've read that book complained that he didn't ask what a lot of people think is probably a tougher moral question, and that is, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do crooked politicians get off the hook? Maybe you think perpetrators of violent crimes or police brutality should face charges, but then they don't. Now, you might want to have the perspective that good and bad things happen for the same reason that anything happens. Maybe this is your perspective. It just is chance. It's just the randomness of life. That's why anything happens to anybody. And maybe you're right. But I want to explore if there's a kind of vision, or more specifically, a perspective that we could adopt that won't just cause us to throw up our hands when injustice surfaces, a perspective that would actually activate us to make real change and free us from the fear that none of this really matters. Now, I want to keep looking at the life of a man named Daniel, and that's who we've been observing throughout this whole series. And in this particular moment in his life, I want to see how his out-of-the-ordinary perspective really helped him a lot when life around him didn't seem fair. More specifically, when good things were happening, it seemed, to bad people. Now, of course, some of you think that the Bible is just full of make-believe, but at the very least, one of the things we can all appreciate about it is that it seems like bad people get what they deserve in these pages. It seems like every day in the Bible, a bad thing happens to a bad person. Now, in real life, of course, we know that total creeps get power and become presidents and even pastors. But in the Bible, they get incinerated, or they get eaten by lions, or they get drowned. It's like the Bible loves to let a sleazeball strut and fret his hour upon the stage, and then that's in the Bible. And I think we'd like to see more of that, right? In chapter 5 of Daniel's memoir about his life, he records the events of specifically October 12th, 539 BC. And that's the night that Babylon, which was built by one of the greatest military rulers of all time, Nebuchadnezzar, fell to a coalition of the Median and the Persian Empire. That was on October 12th. Now, Babylon was ruled at the time that we're going to check in on here by a total creep, a guy named Belshazzar, and he throws this huge house party, bender, orgy kind of a thing, using sacred dishes that he captured from the Jewish temple. And it wasn't because he ran out of glassware. This was a statement that he was making. Beyond just cultural misappropriation, he wanted to spit in the eye of God and the people who worshiped him. Now then, and sure you've probably heard about this, it's reported that during the party, he saw the fingers of a hand, kind of like, Thing from the Addams Family, on this wall. And it's where we get the phrase, actually, the writings on the wall. And actually, when he saw this, what's recorded in the memoir is that he just about pees his pants, this really sure of himself narcissistic ruler. And his advisors, who are clearly paid too much, have absolutely no idea what to make of what they're seeing. So he calls Daniel and promises him the third place of power in Babylon if he can make sense of this mystical graffiti on the wall. And Daniel's super impressed by this opportunity. He's not. In verse 17, this is what Daniel says. Daniel answered the king, "Keep your gifts or give them to somebody else, but I will tell you what the writing means." And frankly, he might have walked in the room and already scanned what was on the wall, the writing on the wall, and he thought, there is nothing that this guy is going to do that's going to matter here in a matter of minutes. Now, if you'll permit me, I want to geek out for just a second here. Until recently, Belshazzar seemed totally made up, like it was a fictitious character written into this Bible story to sort of make a point. There were records of kings leading up to this time, and there was a record of a king in Babylon called Nebuchadnezzar at the same time that Daniel claims Belshazzar's leading. No Belshazzar. Then, actually in recent years, archaeology discovered tablets and various records outside of the Bible that name Belshazzar as co-leading with his dad, Nebuchadnezzar. So it makes sense that the third position that he was offering Daniel was the highest he could give him next to him and his dad. I don't know if you know this, but there's actually no ancient text from this time in antiquity that has as much archaeological verification as the books contained in the library that we call the Bible. In fact, secular archaeologists in these regions that are discovering things in this territory actually use the Bible as a starter for where to dig and what to look for. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating. That's just a little gift for you. Now, back to what I think the point of the message is here in this story. So while Daniel's got everybody's attention, and he's already turned down the offer from Belshazzar, he lays into this ruler. He lays into Belshazzar about his foolishness and his greed and his pride, and you are a bad guy. He lays into him about his bigotry, even though he'd seen how it worked out for the chaos and the regret of the kings before him. Belshazzar just continued to perpetuate evil and oppression and violence against the people that he was ruling over. Then, after taking that opportunity to tell Belshazzar what Daniel was seeing in his life, he goes ahead and makes good on the promise to interpret what was written on the wall. So I want to jump down to verse 25 here. This is the message that was written. Many, many tekel and parson, and forgive my pronunciation there, it's Aramaic, which is the language that Daniel would have been able to read and write. This wasn't like some secret code. And then he goes on to say, this is what the words mean. Many means numbered. In other words, God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end. Tekel means weighed. You've been weighed on the balances and have not measured up. Parson means divided. And your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. He's basically saying, like, yeah, the graffiti says, all of this is done, you failed, it's over, bad guy. And then jump down to verse 30. That very night, October 12th of 539 BC, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. Boom! Just like the Bible, to not make us wait too long for divine judgment to slam down on bad people. And by the way, just last geek out moment, if you'll permit me, there's actually two non-Bible accounts from Herodotus and Xenophon, which are actually the names of my two dogs, describing a raid on Babylon happening the very night of a party, which again seems to verify Daniel's memoir here. Now, next week, in the next message, we're going to be picking up with Darius, who's the Median king who takes over after they conquer Babylon, and how God actually orchestrated Daniel's life to face this fierce opposition now under Darius and transform an entire culture. So you got to come back for that next message. But I'm going to level with you. We really don't buy that this kind of thing happens anymore. Bad people do things, and bad things are going to happen to them. You know, we're modern, we're sophisticated, we're informed. You know, there is seldom writing on the wall when people enact injustice. Not figuratively, there's not writing on the wall, and certainly not literally, there's not writing on the wall. There don't seem to be real, or maybe in our estimation, enough consequences for bad people doing bad things. It sounds good in a Bible story, but we just don't see it in our lives as often as we think we should. Rabbi Kushner explained life is random. Good people get bad things, and sometimes bad people get good things, and good and bad things just happen. You know, Daniel gets fired. Belshazzar's get promoted. So this is a nice Bible story, but unless you were born yesterday, I don't blame you for not believing any of it and not really counting on any of it. Sometimes even bad people's reputation survives. You know, social science calls this the end-of-life bias. So for instance, if Mother Teresa started defrauding people in the last year of her life, it would actually become the first thing that we think about when we think about her entire life. However, and we've experienced this, someone can behave badly their whole life or their entire first marriage, and then they do something heroic, or they look like a great husband or a dad in their second marriage or their second family, and that's how we will choose to remember them. So sometimes bad people don't even get to carry on a bad reputation. So I think it leaves us with a question that it's important for loving, compassionate humans to ask: will there ever be real justice? Well, maybe it's really uncommon to have this perspective, but I actually want us to adopt the perspective of Daniel that we will see justice. That it's possible that even if it doesn't happen when we want it to happen, or it doesn't happen to the measure we think it should happen, we will see justice. It's really not that far-fetched. Life does actually work out that way sometimes. It's not every day, but there really does seem to be a kind of reciprocity built into the way life functions. There was this doctor that once told me that he estimated that 80% of the people that he sees need medical attention because of lifestyle choices, right? Good or bad, we know that our choices matter, that there are consequences to our choices. Before he saw it written on a wall, Daniel had seen this in his life, that sometimes making bad choices resulted in bad consequences. You ever gone to a high school reunion? I know some of you aren't old enough to be going back to high school yet, but I've been to a couple of them now. And high school gave me an education, but if I go to the 10 or if I go to the 20-year reunion, I get more than an education. I get wisdom. I promise you that you are going to learn more in one weekend of a high school reunion than in all 4 years of pimples and pep rallies. I remember seeing the coolest kids or the superstar high schoolers who just chose never to grow up and kept rolling out the same habits until their first marriage crashed and burned or their business tanked. Daniel, in this event here that we're reading about today, was 80 years old. He'd already seen life dish out some justice. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. Now, that might be some comfort for us, that life has some natural consequences built in. But that's actually still a pretty common way of looking at good things happening to bad people. That, hey, life claps back sometimes, right? But that doesn't really encourage us when we want to see more, when full justice hasn't happened yet. So it would be a really odd stance to not just expect to see some justice, but to realize that you don't have to suffer justice at the same time. Wanting to see justice sounds really, really noble when we want it for bad people as we define them. Glad you got canceled, or, glad you lost all of your money, or you got what was coming to you, Belshazzar, or politician, or famous preacher, or dad. Religious people are really, really great at this. That game is played by choosing some pet sins that we think that God is really, really frustrated with, and then when somebody suffers because of that sin, we think, see, judgment of God. But Daniel's moment here invites us to consider that sometimes there's a hand writing on the wall for all of us. Not just people that I think deserve it, but in ways I know I deserve it. If I'm going to be honest with myself, I know that I've done more than I've suffered the consequences from. See, I think uncommon lives see something that transcends fair. Transcends, if you do something bad, a bad thing should happen to you. Listen, a community of Jesus followers who only sees justice looks to the world like narrow, intolerant, judgmental, self-righteous bigots. And that's not the God that we serve. Easter's coming up in just a couple of weeks from when we drop this message. And if anything, Easter is the revelation of a God who reaches the outcast, but also pardons the criminal. He's the ultimate king who cannot be mocked, who will serve justice, but Jesus is a king who would die absorbing the painful side of justice, the consequences of my own self-sufficiency and yours. You see, in the cross, we see justice satisfied. But we can also be spared from suffering justice. And that's the absolute scandal of grace. Listen, if there's a God and God's good, he'll confront evil. Not just the evil that I want him to, but all of it, even the evil in my own story. But the grace of Jesus says, I'll take your place, okay? Like, I'll take the punishment. Will you just admit that you need forgiveness too? You know, not every king could do this when presented with that idea. Not every person could do this. But will you? You know, a few years ago, I was writing a message for a funeral. And I remember being tempted to say, you know, I've only got some of these people listening to me this one time. And it's a time of reflecting on the brevity of life, right? So what would I say? And I was a young pastor at the time. And I was talking to another pastor, getting his advice. And I said, here's what I'm thinking. I think I'm going to tell them that, hey, listen, this guy that we're celebrating today doesn't have any more choices. You know, whatever happens on the other side of your last breath is what happens, and he doesn't get to choose his preference, right? You know, he might have wanted to get his life together this side of death. He might have wanted to treat some of you differently, but it's too late for him. But not for me and not for you, right? Choices matter. So what will you choose today? That was going to be the crux of my funeral message. And the pastor friend, a little bit older, a little bit wiser than me, paused and he said, well, it might not be the time. I've never quite heard it that plainly spoken at a funeral. It's kind of manipulative and it's very insensitive. And he said, but worst of all, it's true. You know, there's this common perspective that says nothing really matters. Like everything's random and there's no real justice at all. There's another common perspective that says, yeah, choices matter, that there's some justice built into life. You know, maybe even they eternally matter. You know, there's a common perspective that says evil people will get their comeuppance, and good people, if they do enough good, and I think I'm one of them, they're going to fare better in the grand scheme of things. That's a common perspective. And I wonder if there's an uncommon perspective that would activate us to feel free in this world and fight for the justice that God wants to see more of around us. You know, there's this one time that I actually had a nightmare that I was sent to hell. And this isn't in the Bible or anything. This is just my imagination or just the burrito that I ate. But in this nightmare, I imagined that hell was this, I died and I got thrown into this place and it was absolutely awful and I was absent of all good and all beauty and all music and all love. But when I got there in the nightmare, I was promised a chance of escaping if I could pass a test 80 years later. I was given 80 years to prepare for a test. And if I passed that test, I get to go to heaven. In the nightmare, though, there was no clarity around what that test entailed. So I started to work on everything. You know, I've got a lifetime to work on it, right? So I learned languages, because maybe that's the test. I studied ethics. I became a piano virtuoso, you know, like Groundhog Day. You know, I trained like it was going to be an Olympic thing. You know, I needed to pass any test that was going to be presented to me at year 80. And then in the nightmare, my name was called and I go into this corridor. I remember this massive thing and I find out that the test is going to be Pac-Man. And I was like, I'm not prepared. I didn't know. And I remember waking up thinking that would be hell. But you know what? If we're honest, some of us are basically living that hell today. I mean, do you really think that a God who loves you would demand that you perform to be accepted? That's not love. No wonder you're working so hard. No wonder you're so scared. What if God loved you enough to just join you now if you'll trust him, to accept you now if you will trust him, to call you his beloved now? See, I think that's why Jesus isn't just good ideas. He's good news. You are not accepted on what you've done, but what he's done for you. But love isn't going to force itself on you. You get to choose. So the question I have directly is, will you choose to trust him and start a new life with him today? Will you choose to be free of trying to guess what writing is going to be on the wall and whether or not when your days are numbered, you will measure up? And if so, as I invite people all the time, a great relationship just starts with a conversation. And that conversation with God that you could have today is something like, God, I know that I wouldn't measure up. I don't even measure up to my own ideals. So I accept the fact that I need to be forgiven. I accept the fact that you have made it possible for me to be forgiven. Jesus, you died on the cross to prove I've got nothing left to pay for. And I believe you're alive again to prove I have nothing left to fear. So today, without knowing all of the answers, Jesus, will you save me from a life without you? And will you lead me to a life that I can't have without you? Now, I want to encourage you that if you did that today, the first thing that God wants you to know is that you are not meant to live any of this exceptional life alone. So let us know that you made that choice today by texting the word choice to 77977, and someone is going to connect with you right away. And by the way, if you're in the LA area and you are a follower of Jesus and you have never chosen to make it public in the sacred moment of baptism, we're actually going to be hosting safe and unforgettable baptisms here in just a few weeks. So I want you to find out more about that by going to radius.church right now.
Hey, thank you for joining us this week. Head on over to radius.church to download your Easter graphics right to your phone and start inviting for Easter. And if you're new, we want to meet you and support you. Just go to radius.church, click the I'm New button so that we can have someone reach out to you, get you your free ebook. Next week is all about persecution, so it's going to be a really, really good one. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people. And no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, Radius is here to help. Bye, everyone.